Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a deep dive and a review of Nevernight by J. Kristoff. This is the first book in the Nevernight Chronicles and I have been wanting to read this book for so many years. And the reason why is because I read Empire of the Vampire whenever it first came out and I absolutely loved that book. While I did have issues with it, overall it was a really great experience. I really liked the characters, and whilst it was a bit cheesy in certain places, I did really like the overall tone of the book. The second book, however, Empire of the Damned, was a complete miss for me, and I don't think it was even remotely close in terms of living up to the expectations that were set in book one. It was a very big disappointment for me, just was not that great, and I will definitely read the third book in that series because I am very curious as to how it's going to end given the cliffhanger at the end of book two. But I'm not holding out hope. With Nevernight, this is described as like a grim, dark assassin fantasy, and I have heard a lot of questionable things about J. Kristoff and particularly about this series. Now, I'm one of those people that I generally take what people say in good faith, but I also like to experience things myself and form my own conclusions. So I did actually go into this book with fairly low expectations. I didn't want to go into it thinking that it was going to be a favourite, but I also didn't go into it thinking that I was going to absolutely hate it. I went into it with the perspective of giving it a fair chance, and I do just want to say, overall, I absolutely detested this book. And I will just say my disclaimer now. If you love this book, because I know a lot of people love this book and this series, fair enough. If you can't take constructive criticism about it, don't watch this video. If you hear me say anything negative about the book, please don't take it personally. This is not a personal attack on you. It's not even an attack on the author. It's just my thoughts and my reflections as I was reading the book. So please do keep that in mind. I personally think this is one of the dumbest books I've ever read, and I will walk you through over the next 40 to 50, maybe even 60 minutes as to why I personally don't think this is a well-written or enjoyable book. Let me give a very brief non-spoiler summary, and I will just say that I don't think the writing is that great in this book. I don't think it's the worst writing I've ever read, but I also don't think it's great. It's very J. Kristoff. And by that I mean, if I didn't know this was written by J. Kristoff, the first person that I would say this was written by is J. Kristoff. Like, he has a very specific type of writing. There's a very specific tone that I think is attached to his books. And love him or hate him, I think that's actually quite interesting, and I think that's quite a testament to the author. That being said, I do think that there are certain aspects of the tone of this book, and I'll go on to this more when I talk about my spoiler thoughts, that I just don't think worked very well. And I think it came across as edgy edgelord trying to be edgy. And I've talked about this before in other reviews that I personally don't find that enjoyable. I find it cringe. It takes me out of the story because I find it cringe, and it's just not an enjoyable experience for me. I also really did not like the characters in this book. The characters in this book are so one note, they are so one-dimensional, and I don't really understand like why people love our main character so much. I just don't think she's compelling. I don't think she's particularly original. I just found her to be quite laughable, to be honest. There are also some very questionable things that happen in this book. Again, I'll talk about that in the spoiler section. That really did make me feel uncomfortable, and I'm not the sort of person that it takes a lot to make me feel uncomfortable. I read a lot of grim dark fantasy, and even just dark literature. But there was something about this book that just made me feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And I'll come more onto that later. The thematic work felt very surface level. It just didn't really feel like it was really going anywhere. It didn't really feel like it dug deep enough. I know there are 2 more books, but we should already start to get a sense of how the thematic work is going to play out, and I feel like we didn't really get that. Again, I think it's because it lacks originality. It's just like every other assassin fantasy series that you've probably read. It most certainly read like that for me. I think with that out of the way, let's go through my notes on my Kindle. And yeah, there's not going to be much structure to this. I'm actually going to try and keep this to about 40 minutes if I can. And with that in mind, let's start. And do turn off now if you don't want to hear any spoiler thoughts about this book. All right, so the first thing that we read from our narrator in the first chapter is, people often shit themselves when they die. And that really just sets the tone for the whole book. Now, I'm not against kind of tongue-in-cheek humour. I'm not against sarcastic, almost crass humour. I wouldn't say my humour is particularly crass, but like I'm very sarcastic. I'm British. It's literally a part of our DNA. And I really appreciate it when it's done well. There's a reason why Abercrombie and Parker are two of my favourite authors. They both do this exceptionally well. But I think Christoph's version of that is just not satisfying to me. I just want to cringe, to be honest. I just feel like cringing. It sets a tone that I don't particularly find appealing, and I know I'm going to get people saying, why did you read the book? Well, because I like reading books that also make me feel like I need to understand why I don't like them, if you know what I mean. Like, I don't think you should only read 5-star books. Like, I think you should read books that make you question why you don't like a book, and that's exactly how I would view Nevernight and Iron Flame and all the Sarah J Maas books. Like, I'd put them all in the same bucket at this point. Then we get introduced to our main character, Mia. And Mia, she's not like other girls, she's different. She's, she comes from a wealthy background, but at the same time, she's edgy and she can fight men and she can, do whatever she needs to do to get out of a troubled situation. Like, it's boring. Like, Mia to me is like the quintessential YA protagonist who is like 16, 17, 18 years old, is figuring things out and is like a bit cringe with it. Like, I think we were all a bit cringe when we were in our teenage years. And that's how Mia reads to me. She doesn't read like a gritty adult fantasy character, which is how this character is portrayed. It is a dark adult fantasy world. And yet she reads extremely, extremely young. And that's fine, by the way. I have no critique of that. But it's the fact that this is positioned as an adult fantasy book, but it reads like a YA book with a bit of extra swearing and a bit of extra crassness. So the first chapter is Mia basically getting physically involved, sexually involved with another character. And the imagery that is set in this first chapter is really odd. And again, it's not uncomfortable in the sense that it's supposed to make you uncomfortable. It just makes me feel uncomfortable because something doesn't feel right, if you know what I mean. And I will just give you a couple of instances of this. The sight of his carrion smile and rope raw hands sets her shivering, heart racing, insides aching with want. And then on the next page we get, she breathed heavier, tingling somewhere deep and old. What is this imagery? Tingling somewhere deep and old. Who says that? Like, literally, who says that? And then it says, she didn't want this to begin or to end. That, to me, is really weird. Anybody else find that weird? She didn't want this to begin or to end. There's another word for that. Then we keep going with weird descriptions like quivering like a newborn colt. I actually wrote in my note, ew. Like, I don't know why, that just makes me feel really disgusting. And then we actually find out that Mia is 16 years old. 16 years old. Now look, I get it. 16 years old, you're of age. I get it. You're of age of consent. Totally get it. But I don't know why you would have an adult fantasy book start off in this way with a sexual scene and the character is 16. It's like, when you watch like Euphoria, like that HBO TV show, and you've realised that the actors are playing really young characters, and it just adds an extra layer of disgust to the show, to the point where it actually made me stop watching it because I felt really gross watching it. Like, why couldn't the writer just aged up the characters so they were like in college? That would be less weird in my opinion. It's the same logic here. Like, why is she 16? Even if she was 18, that would be much less weird. It's just the fact that she's 16 and she's quivering like a newborn colt. Oh, so disgusting. So disgusting. And we even get recognition from the writer that Mia is a girl. He literally writes on page 7, she is a girl. So you're even acknowledging that she's not a woman yet. She's a girl. Oh man, It's so weird. It's so weird to me. Why would you write that? Just make her 18. I don't understand why this is so hard to do. Then we get more progression into the scene. I'm not going to go into it too deep because, like I said, it genuinely actually makes me feel a bit sick. It gets quite vivid and quite descriptive, as you can probably imagine, with Jay Kristoff. And I just kept writing, this is gross. This is gross. This is gross. And it even goes so far as to put you in Mia's head as she's going throughout this process, and she's questioning whether she's liking it, whether it should feel this way. Like, it's not nice, folks. It's really not nice. Then one of the things that really kind of irked me, and this is only on page 9 in chapter 1, by the way, which is a sweetness to set her tingling again, despite the awkwardness and breathlessness and hurtingness of it all. Why are you writing this? Like, why are you writing this? It's disgusting. That is disgusting. She's 16 years old. Then we keep going and we get some kind of writing technique that Jay Kristoff does where he does kind of like parallels. So as we know, as I mentioned, Mia is an assassin, and it talks about what it feels like to kill someone. And then at the same time, he kind of rewrites the exact same scene whilst she is doing the deed with this person. And it, like, in theory, it should work. Like, I quite like that idea as a technique, but I just think it was so poorly executed that I think a little bit of more thought could have taken it to the next level. Then on page 11, we get the recognition from the author himself, because he's literally written this book, that Mia looks younger than her years. So she's 16 years old. 16-year-old girls generally look pretty young anyway, and she looks even younger than her years. Look, why? Why? It's weird to me. That's weird to me. And then in the next page, we get, on her skin for a moment, she found it hard to think of herself as anything more than a girl. And my note here was, talk about trying to force a specific narrative. And I think this is where I have difficulty with Kristoff, where he's trying to position something or a character in a certain way, and it just makes me feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Because there is no reason why this character needs to be 16 years old. There is no reason why we need to be told that she looks younger than her years. There is no reason for her to be called a girl. It's disgusting. Like, there's dark worlds and being edgy, but this is just gross. Like, it's gross. I can't get over the grossness to be able to say anything about the darkness, if you know what I mean. Whereas if you look at a world like Baker, where the women are written in a very certain way, but they're so compelling. They're so compelling. And they are women as well, right? They are older and they are women and they are more experienced in life. There is just no reason, absolutely zero reason why this character needs to be 16 years old. Seriously. Okay. Then we keep going and we basically learn pretty early on like what is going to be the setting of this book. And that is that Mia is going to go to like this assassin school, I think it's called the Red School, to learn how to be a proper assassin. This first couple of chapters are building up to that, and then the majority of the book is set in this kind of like school setting. I have said this before, I do often like a school setting. I think it's very overdone in fantasy, but if it's done well, I enjoy it. And I think in this one, and we'll come to onto it later on, it was done okay. Like, I wouldn't say it was super bad, but I also wouldn't say it was super good. So now let's move on to chapter 2. We get some additional context about Mia's backstory, and we learn that her father was basically like in the Senate. Like, this is very much influenced by Rome. It's very much influenced. So there is literally the Senate, and he basically just ripped it off, which again, I'm not against, but like, at least try to be a bit inventive with it. He like literally calls it the Senate. And one of the interesting reflections that I made towards the end of this book is Mia feels like a rip-off of Maximus from Gladiator. And I'll tell you why when I come onto that section later on. But based on the way that he writes her character, you know, she's obviously a lot younger than Maximus is, but she comes from a rich family, she loses everything, she becomes an assassin, obviously he becomes a gladiator. But there are so many parallels to Maximus and the Gladiator IP that I I did find that quite intriguing. And I know that's not a particularly original story, but the similarities are like a little bit too close, if you know what I mean. Maybe he's just a fan of Gladiator, which fair enough, who isn't? So we learn that her father basically betrayed the ruling person, and he gets murdered, and then all of his affiliates also get murdered. Her mother gets taken away. I'm just going to skip through this. Her mother gets taken away, and she basically gets taken prisoner, and she's able to escape at some point in the future. The consul, whose name is Julius Scaver, is the guy that killed Mia's father and also Mia's mother. So motive already gets set up pretty quickly, which I do actually appreciate. We know that this is going to be a revenge story, and that her going to assassin school isn't just going to be about learning how to be an assassin, but it's ultimately to learn how she can kill the consul as well, and his affiliates too. In chapter 2, we learn that Mia is not a pretty thing. It literally says she wasn't a pretty thing. And I find this really interesting because almost always in fantasy books, the female character is like really beautiful or like really attractive. Believe it or not, that's actually what happens in this book as well, because Mia has surgery, basically a fantastical version of surgery, which we'll come on to later on, and I have very, very strong opinions about that. So basically, we will know at some point in the future that she will no longer not be attractive, because God forbid that. One of the things that he says about her face is, if her face were a puzzle, most would put it back in the box unfinished. That's so mean. That's so mean. And then he keeps going. He just keeps going. Not a beauty that lovers would die for, armies would march for, heroes might slay a god or demon for. And then I wrote, yet, ... because it's coming. It's coming, folks. It's coming. Some of the cringe writing really just took me over the edge by the end of this book. Lay hand upon me again, sir, and I'll feed your jewels to the effing drakes. So edgy, Mia. So edgy. So edgy. We also get an allusion to what her magic power is, and she's basically got like shadow magic, which I like as a concept, but I've not read anybody who's written it well yet, and unfortunately Christoph has now been added to that list. Basically, her shadows can like cloak her actions, and she can use it as like a weapon of force as well. She doesn't know how to properly use her powers, and that's partly why she wants to go to the school, so she can learn how to use them properly. There is also like a degree of sentience to her magic, like it shows itself in the form of a cat, and she can actually communicate with the cat as well, which I actually thought was quite an interesting concept. In chapter 3, we continue to get really dumb wordplay. Despite being as much at home in the saddle as a nun in a brothel. Come on, do better, J. Christoph. Do better. I know this book is quite old, but come on. Come on. Then Mia basically goes on her travels, and she goes to find the Red Church, who are the people that she wants to learn from. She ends up staying at like an inn or like a pub basically, and she sees another guy turn up who she also suspects is looking for the Red Church. They have like some little minor interactions. She notes that he's attractive. He has like tattoos all over his face, which I think is meant to be Maori influence, but don't quote me on that. And she at some point notes that if he didn't have the tattoos on his face, he would be really good looking, which I thought was a really weird thing to write. They end up both leaving around the same time to go and find the Red Church. She jumps onto a horse, ends up falling flat on her face, and the boy that she sees ends up laughing at her, because let's be honest, who wouldn't laugh at that? It's also really funny how Mia's character is constantly written to be like not other girls. She's so quirky. She's so quirky. She's not even that attractive, at least not yet. Like, oh my gosh. Some of the language is very bizarre in this book, because it is very clear that this is like an Italian-inspired world, right? As I mentioned, you know, you have the Senate, even the naming conventions of like the leaders in the Senate are like very similar to Rome. Like, it's very bizarre to me how some of the language that is used is like very British. Some of the swear words, I'm not going to say them because I don't want to get demonetized. But there are like some very quintessential English insults that are said in this book, and it really took me out of the book because it doesn't line up with the overall atmosphere and world building that Kristoff has done in the first couple of chapters. Like, it just feels very at odds with one another, and it doesn't really seem to make sense to me personally. And obviously with a character like Mia, you know, all about the girl power, right? And one of the things that she says, why should what's between my legs be considered any smarter or stupider, any worse or better? It's all just meet Don Trick. And Don Trick is the guy that she met at the tavern or inn or whatever you want to call it. And look, I appreciate the sentiment. I agree. Like, I agree with that underlying philosophy. But it's just the tone. It's just the way that it's written. Like, it feels very cringe. I just feel like I can't take her very seriously because, you know, she also comes from a very rich and powerful family, bear in mind. And yet she like purposefully talks in a way that's very crass. It just feels very at odds with her character and her upbringing. And I get maybe she's trying to hide herself or something, but like, why go from one extreme to the next? I don't know, it just felt very off for me. One of the things that I wrote down when we first meet Trick is that he's going to be a love interest for Mia, and within the first of like 1 or 2 chapters of him meeting her, we get a little ditty from Kristoff, and he says young Trick was in love. And I wrote, knew it. Then we get a flashback. There are flashbacks in this book, and I think the flashbacks in general, again, were done okay. I don't think there's anything exceptionally good about them or exceptionally bad. We get essentially like vignettes into her past life with different family members, but also we learn more about what she actually experienced after her family was taken away from her. And we get some conversations between her and her mum. And her mum says to her, your mind will serve you better than any trinket under the sun. She'd said, it is a weapon, Mia, and like any weapon, you need practice to be any good at wielding. Again, I agree with that sentiment. Then she goes on to say, beauty you're born with, but brains you earn. And I wrote in my comment, I thought she was meant to be ugly. Like, at least be consistent, you know. And no parent is necessarily going to admit that their child is ugly, but I feel like if she's meant to be like pretty damn ugly, like, why call that out? It just doesn't really seem consistent with what we've been told. And then we find out that like Mia doesn't really seem afraid by what's happened, even after the events with what happened with her father. And I just found that to be really surprising. Bear in mind, at this point, she must be a pretty young teen. She's not 16 yet, so she must be like maybe 14, 15, maybe even younger actually. And yeah, it's constantly reminded to us that she doesn't feel afraid. She's unafraid. And it's like, this does make no sense. She's been born into a life of privilege and she lost everything. She lost her family and she doesn't know anyone. She's alone. And yet she's unafraid. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, if she was born on the street, fair enough, that would make more sense because she probably would have had to adjust right to that sort of lifestyle. But it's the fact that she's unafraid despite living a life of like privilege and wealth. Like, it doesn't add up. And then we actually get a sentence from Trick where he says, you are unlike any girl I have ever, and I wrote, not like other girls, because we need to be reminded of that multiple times throughout this book. Then Trick and Mia basically band together to try to find the red church. A bunch of stuff happens, nothing that much of note. We keep getting flashbacks. We get a flashback between Mia and her teacher. I forgot his name, but he's basically kept an eye on her and like supported her and helped her like build some basic assassin skills. And he says to her, nothing is where you start. Own nothing, know nothing, be nothing. Why would I want to do that? The old man crushed out his cigarillo on the boards between them. His smile made her smile in return, because then you can do anything. Again, I kind of agree with the sentiment. It's just the tone, like, it's just his writing style. I find it to be so cringe that I can't look beyond what he's saying. And that's probably my fault, and I totally accept it. I take full responsibility. But do better at the same time. Do better. Then we get more realizations from Mia that Trick is handsome, and because he has high cheekbones and the most piercing eyes, blue eyes, bear in mind, she'd ever seen. And apparently he also spoke with a voice that made Mia tingle in all the wrong places. Ew. We also learn more about Trick, and we learn that there is this word that is used to describe people like Trick, and they are essentially people who are the product of grape. And it's very sad, like it's a very traumatic kind of thing to have to read about. There's this section in this book where we get an explanation as to what this word is. The word is coffee, and Trick gets called that word at some point in the future, and we learn early on that this is like a really horrible insult to call someone, because it's referring to somebody who is like a half caste. It's referring to someone who is a product of something that was really horrible and awful. They go on to say that basically somebody who is called a coffee is someone who is the bastard child of an unwilling mother. And I don't know why, but this really rubbed me up the wrong way. I think it's with this sort of thematic work around identity and also what it means for a child when they're born out of such a horrifying situation. I think that's such an important conversation to have, but I think it has to be done with a certain amount of delicateness. It has to be done with a certain amount of sensitivity as well, and I just don't think Jay Kristoff has that skill. At the end of the day, he's trying, or he attempted to write a grim dark or a dark fantasy book, but it just comes across really, really cringe. And so when you couple the very cringe writing and dialogue with some of this genuinely quite dark stuff, it feels very jarring to the reader, because on the one hand this book is so unserious, but then you get these really serious moments that just feel very out of place. I personally think you need to have a very intentional writer to talk about that sort of stuff, and I don't think that's Jay Kristoff in this instance. Then we're going to fast forward a little bit. Mia and Trick find the Red Church and they say to them, look, you can join. There's going to be a bunch of competitions, and the people who are at the top of those competitions by the end of the year or whatever, you're going to be in essentially what is you're going to be one of the top assassins basically, and you're going to be able to be in a position of power, essentially. We get introduced to one of the teachers, and Mia, being the gobby little shite that she is, basically tries to get too clever, and he ends up hacking off her arm, which I thought was actually quite funny. But at the same time, with a lot of these types of books, I always find it really interesting as to why the teachers want to actively injure and kill sometimes their students. And even though she gets healed and she's perfectly fine after a few days, it's just such a weird thing to kind of have in your school system in the first place. Why would you want to do that? I get you want to punish her so she doesn't do it again, you want some sort of standard, I guess, but it just felt very weird. And I had the exact same issue in Fourth Wing. Why do so many students get genuinely just murdered when you need these people to help you? So odd. She goes on to say that this teacher has the beauty of a fresh suicide. What? The beauty of a fresh suicide? Can a Nevernight fan, genuinely, I'm not saying this to be sarcastic or anything, but someone who is a fan of this book, tell me why that's a good piece of writing. The beauty of a fresh suicide. That is disgusting. It's disgusting. I didn't know suicide was beautiful. It's just so disgusting. It's like when someone tries to be so edgy that they end up just shooting themselves in the foot. It's so gross. We get further reinforcement that Mia is not like other girls. There's a character called Ash who we get quite a bit of time with later on. Ash is a pretty one-note character. I honestly couldn't tell you that much about this character. And Ash says, ladies first, bowing towards the door. Mia responds, I don't see any ladies around here, do you? So dumb. Cassius, the teacher who chopped off her arm, is very similar to Mia. So he also has shadow magic, and she basically wants him to teach her how to use her shadows. He refuses. We'll come back to that later on. She's desperate to learn from him though, because obviously she's never met another one like her. They're called Darkin, that's their name. And it's quite rare from what I understand, of course, because she's not like other girls, remember? Then we learn about another teacher, I've forgotten her name, but I'm sure it'll come up. And she is a teacher that teaches her students in the gentle arts, persuasion, seduction, sex, that kind of thing. That's a direct quote. And I just wrote, lol, I can see where this is going. And this is the thing with this sort of book, because it's just so unoriginal. You know exactly what's going to happen by the end of the book. Like, there's no sense of tension. There's no sense of like what's happening, what's going to happen. Like, it's just very samey. We keep getting references that Mia would never be a beauty, that she's ugly, blah, blah, blah. And we then come on to what I think is one of the most ridiculous, dumbest plot points of any book I have ever read. And this is even more than Fourth Wing. This is even more than any Sarah J Maas book. This is, I think, probably some of the worst like writing I've ever read in my entire lifetime, which is saying something, because there's some pretty awful books that I read. And we basically learn that Mia gets a boob job. A 16-year-old. A 16-year-old. And I think when you put it in the context of a man writing this, that is very, very weird to me. That is very weird to me. Again, if she was 18, I mean, I'd still be like, what on earth is going on here? But it would be less weird. She is 16 years old. And also, why does she need that? Why does she need that? How does that make her a better assassin? How? It doesn't make any sense. The person who does basically the plastic surgery says to her that they're gonna fix her and they're gonna make her look better. And then the revelation of her boob job is she pulled open the ties at her throat, looked down to the place her breast hadn't been, because she had like tiny breasts apparently. It's just stuff like this that I personally just don't think is forgivable. Bear in mind, she's 16, she looks younger than her age, and she's been given a boob job. I thought the whole point of assassins was that they could like mold into anyone, right? And you didn't have to change them to do that. But clearly, what do I know about being an assassin? And we then keep getting this constant references to her looks now. And, you know, she basically gets like some pretty privilege because people treat her differently and she feels better in herself, whatever. We learn about this thing called the Blood Walk. The Blood Walk essentially allows the people in HQ to travel from HQ to God's Grave. Now, God's Grave is basically like Rome. It's like the main city. It's where like the imperial power sits. It's where her family, it's where she was born, where she grew up, it's where her family is. So it basically allows for like fast transportation between the two places. This does become important later on. And one of the things that she says, or she reflects on as she's walking through the Red Walk, she says, imagine if the Republic could move its armies around the world at will. And I wrote, this is going to happen. And something very similar does happen later on in this book. We also do get constant references to her shadow power. And one of the things that I think gets massively underplayed in this book is how much of an advantage that gives her. Like, I know she doesn't know how to use her power that well, but still she's able to cloak herself in shadows. Like, that gives her a massive advantage over anybody else who doesn't have this power. And yet, like, nobody brings it up. Nobody really, like, gets like annoyed about that. Like, if I was a student and I was competing against her, I would get super annoyed about that because you just have a distinct unfair advantage. We get some allusion to the fact that the political situation is not that great in God's Grave, and that essentially the consul is trying to manipulate the political system so that he can stay in power for longer than he should be. I think he's been in power for like 3 terms, and he's trying to get into power for a full term, but I think the maximum amount of terms that someone can be consul is similar to how it is in the US. You only are allowed 2 terms and that's it. But he's like gone way beyond that. So we can see that there is political instability, people are unhappy, and things are probably going to start popping off. Mia gets captured when she's in God's Grave, and we find out later on that this is all a test. I did suspect that this was a test. It's a test basically to see if she would say anything about the Red Church. Lord Cassius, the guy who is also a Darkin and is the guy that she wants to learn her magic from, is like really happy with her and the way that she performed. Apparently his beauty was colder still. Don't know what that means. Another really cringe line that I saw that I just kind of laughed out loud when I saw it was, iron or glass, they'd asked. Mia clenched her jaw, shook her head. She was neither. She was steel. So dumb. So dumb. All right, we're going to keep pushing forward. There's more beautiful people and there's more machinations that are happening. I'm not going to bother touching on any of that. There's a little side quest that Mia goes on to basically learn more about Darkin powers. So she goes to the library and we literally learn that there are bookworms that can like consume the readers of the library. Like, it's such a funny concept. I actually wrote, OMG, how dumb. Like, it's so dumb. It's so like unoriginal again. They're like literally the shapes of worms and they like, I don't know if they like actually eat people, but they like do something to them. And then she talks about Burn After Reading, which I don't know if anybody knows, that's a movie. I think George Clooney was in it. It's actually a great movie. I haven't watched it in a while. But I find these like constant modern references and like language inconsistencies very odd. It takes you out of the book. This is supposed to be, again, a very Italian based, you know, system, and it's also not set in modern day from what I can tell, right? It's not like a modern day fantasy world, but the modern references just don't really make sense and they just don't really work because it confuses you as the reader, and to me that's indicative of bad writing. There was one quote that I actually really liked, and this is said by the guy at the library. He says, "The books we love, they love us back, and just as we mark our places in the pages, those pages leave their marks on us. I can see it in you, sure as I see it in me. You're a daughter of words, a girl with a story to tell." Again, a girl, not a woman, a girl. And I don't love this book, so I don't think this book loves me back. All right, let's keep going. We get the realization from Mia that Trick sleeps naked. What? If this was like a romantasy, I'd be like, okay, look, it's still dumb, but I kind of get it. But this isn't a romantasy book, and I don't get these like really weird things that just take you out of the book. She basically goes to visit McKnight. There's been a lot of like sexual tension between the two of them. There's allegedly chemistry there, and they basically start doing the business. One thing that, again, I found really disgusting, and that I think, because it's not only just by itself, if you look at it in the broader context of this book, there's a bit where he writes, he tried to pull away. And I wrote, why is she forcing him? Disgusting. And again, if we go back to the quotes that I quoted at the start of this book, she was being forced to do something that she didn't want to do. And I just think that's so disgusting, personally. There's a word that Christoph used when they're kissing, and he says mooched, which just feels like a really modern word. Again, like, why are you using these weirdly modern words in this like not particularly modern writing, if you know what I mean? It's very jarring. Trick says to Mia while they're going at it, "Get your girls out," or some such. Guys, I would read the whole scene, but I honestly don't think I can do it. Like, I really don't think I can do it. One of the things that Mia is trying to do is she's trying to become top of one of the classes. And one of the classes is like poison work. It's like all to do with like herbs and stuff like that. And one of the tasks that any of the students can do is basically try to find like the solution to this particular potion or poison or something. Because the way that it's set up is that every student has to participate in a bunch of different tasks. You don't have to participate in every single task, that you can just pick one, but you're taking more of a risk, because if you fail that task and you don't come top of the class, then you will not progress further, right? And she picks the poison one, and she also picks the fighting one. And so throughout the second half of this book, she's constantly trying to figure out like what is the poison and what is the solution to the problem. Jessamine, who I haven't talked about, she's like this bully, how original, who really absolutely hates Mia. And there's this kind of manufactured sense of friction between the two of them. They try to steal her notes at one point, but we'll come on to that later on. Trick tells Mia more about his backstory and about what happened to him and what happened to his mother. It's quite sad, to be honest. And she says a very sweet but nevertheless still cringe thing, and she says, "This makes you who you are." She punched the slab of muscle above his heart. This. Sweet but cringe. And apparently he's the kind of handsome a girl might raise an army for, slay a god or demon for, this girl at least. And again, we're seeing parallels in the writing. Like, I don't know if you remember, but I actually read this exact same quote, but it was about Mia a couple of chapters ago. So he tries to kind of reuse the same sentences. I think he thinks this is some really intelligent mechanism, but I just don't think it's done very well. Then Mia rose up on all fours, prowled across the furs, eyes locked on his. She spends a lot of time on all fours, which makes me think something very, very bizarre. I'm not going to say what it is. I'm not going to spell it out, but you might get where I'm going with this. Like, what is this obsession with this girl being on all fours? Weird. I do feel like the sex scenes in this book feel like very much a male fantasy, you know, and like a teenage male fantasy. And look, I'm not a teenage male, but you know, I did know many. It really does read like a teenage male fantasy. And it's gross to me because, as I've said throughout this video so far, there are multiple scenes where there's like coercion, the characters feel like they're being forced. It's just weird. I don't know. I don't like it. Carlotta, one of her friends, dies. Again, I didn't mention her because she's really not that important. She's the one who's in the lead to win the poison task. And Mia basically gets set up by some of the other characters because they hate her and they want her to die and they don't want her to progress forward. But the thing is that Trick and Mia were obviously together, and so she has an alibi. But the problem with that is that Trick wasn't supposed to be out of his bedroom after lights out, because there's this like absolute zero tolerance rule that if you go out after lights out, then you will be severely punished. Like, they get whipped, I think it is. It's horrible. They basically just like set her up and she can't do anything about it. She can't tell the teachers that she was with Trick, because then her and Trick would still be in trouble. It's the really funny thing about this is like absolutely no actual conversation or like proof is given that she killed the other character. Because she's the only left-handed person, and because Carlotta, or whatever her name was killed on her left side or her right side or whatever, that means that it must have been Mia. And this is where I think this book is just so stupid and it's so dumb, because anybody could know that, right? Anybody could know that she's the only left person and make it look like she's the one who did it. Like, how hard is that for somebody to do? It's so dumb. And they look at zero evidence. Like, that's the only evidence they have to decide that she's guilty. They say, very well, in light of the evidence and with no compelling testimony to the contrary. Bear in mind, they've talked about this for about 10 seconds. Your guilt is confirmed. What sort of like system is that? Like, it's not as if the punishment is like just a slap on the hand. Like, it's a legitimately traumatizing, painful thing that they're going to do to her. It's so stupid. And they basically sentence her to 100 lashes. We find out that her brother might still be alive. There was an assumption that her entire family was murdered, but there is an allusion to the fact that her brother might be alive. So I reckon in the next book or the third book, he will come into it. Then Mia basically sets up Jessamine and Jessamine's brother to fail because she realizes that they stole her notes about the solution to the task that I mentioned. Like, it's just so convoluted, this entire plot. And she sets it up so that they can make the poison, but the poison will actually cause problems because she knows they're going to steal it. She knew that they were potentially going to do something. So she basically set it up so that they would then also suffer. And Ash's, I think his name is Diamo. I think he actually is the one that tries the potion, because you have to try the potion before you go to the teacher to like verify whether it's actually done in the proper way. And when he's drank it, he goes, sorry. It's so funny. It's so funny. Because they fight, and then through their fight, he like starts to feel weird. And that's basically the dummy potion, like killing him. But it's just really, really, really funny. And then Trick basically clocks onto the fact that Mia went to his bedroom and had fun with him because she wanted them to go into her room to pick up her notes about the poison. So it was all intentional, it was all set up, and Trick feels like he's been used, basically. They then have a fight. She then calls him coffee, which is that awful word that I talked about earlier on. And she does that as well intentionally because she's so super smart and ahead of everybody else. She does it so that he will be angry with her. So when they fight, because they have to fight next, that he won't hold back. Well, in chapter 30, we're coming up towards the end now. In chapter 30, we learn that the fabric of Trick's clothes are voiceless. How can clothes be voiceless? I think he means noiseless. Voiceless. I do wonder sometimes, like I really do wonder. One of the other tasks is about stealing this really important like key or something from one of the really senior teachers in the school, and the way one of the guys is able to do that is because he's able to create a forgery of clay of the key. And I just feel like that's such a stupid way to like fool someone. Because like surely the teacher will be able to feel that a forgery of clay is not the same as like silver. Like surely they feel different. Like I didn't get that. Like I don't get how a forgery of clay seems like a good way to fool a professional and somebody who's been wearing this key around their neck for like probably years and years and years. So stupid. And then we get another reference back to the iron, glass or steel. She says iron or glass or steel, what she was made of now made no difference at all. It was what she would become when she killed this boy that would truly matter. And the boy that they're referring to is Trick because they're about to start fighting. And again, it's just a bit cringe, I think. A bunch of stuff happens and we get a kissing scene between Ash and Mia. And again, it just feels very male gazy, you know? We then jump ahead. Competitions have been happening and things are starting to come together. We find out that Ash is actually not a good person and that she and her brother have been trying to get vengeance for their father, who was treated really badly, if I remember correctly, by the Red Church. So they basically infiltrated the Red Church. Their whole mission has been to kill the various different teachers because of what they did to their father. And Ash kills Trick. The interesting thing is that we don't see a body. So I think Trick is actually not dead, even though he got stabbed quite a lot, but we never see a body. And if we never see a body, then they're not dead in my eyes. So she kills Trick. Mia doesn't know that yet. She finds out later on. This twist kind of, like I get it, but I didn't like it because it just felt very inorganic. We didn't really get any hints to Ash's deception. Like I think if you're going to do this sort of plot, like you should intelligently weave in hints that something isn't right. But this literally just comes out of nowhere. Like it comes out of nowhere. She wants to kill Cassius and they basically try to kill all of the teachers as well. They've also told some other guy, I think his name is Remus or something, to bring his mates and they're gonna like help them take down the Red Church. They use the walk, that tunnel thing that I mentioned earlier. Nice bit of foreshadowing there. And they use that to get into the Red Church because they allowed them to walk through it. Mia at this point is back in God's grave. She's with her old teacher, Mercurio, and Ash like pretty much purposefully said to her, like, you should leave. But Mia actually leaves because there was one final mission that they were supposed to do in order to become like the acolytes. And they basically had to kill just some random innocent person. And she wasn't willing to do that. So she ends up leaving before all of this murdering starts happening. She then starts to feel like something isn't right. So she goes back to the school and she starts to notice what is happening. There's people there that shouldn't be there. And she thinks that she needs to help everybody else. The author even goes as far as to write she was the only one who could save them. Of course. It's not like she's just been training for the past 200 pages for this exact task. She realises that she's been betrayed by Ash. She obviously feels very frustrated about that. We find out that Ash is the one who actually killed Lottie, her friend, who made the poison before, and she's been the one who's like pulling all the strings. Again, we get zero hinting of this. It just comes out of nowhere. Like, I think if you're going to do this sort of like deceptive play, You need to sew in tiny little hints to make it interesting, but that just does not happen at all. She kills Osric. Osric is Ash's brother. Things start happening. I'm going to just power through this next bit. They end up being taken somewhere else, and she ends up going to find Cassius and the other teachers to go and save them. And there's one quote that she says, because there's 3 people that she really wants to kill. Like, there's the consul, and then there's 2 other guys. They were like bodyguards or something who tried to kill her at one point. And she says this little speech towards the end of the book. It's all I am anymore. It's all that's left inside of me. You killed me, Remus, just as sure you killed my familia. And I wrote, OMG, he is literally trying to recreate Gladiator. Lol. And that was where I got the realization, like, he's literally trying to recreate Gladiator, but in like an allegedly dark fantasy world. Again, I'm not against that, but you got to do it well, and unfortunately I don't think it was done well in this book. Another really weird modern term that gets used in this book is trump card. Such a weird word to use in like a Italian influenced word. It's so bizarre. Ashlyn they end up coming face to face with Ashlyn after she rescues the teachers, but Ashlyn just runs away. So Ashlyn is not dead by the end of this book. She's obviously going to come back in the next book. And that's going to probably be, you know, Mia's next task is to find Ashlyn, kill Ashlyn, and then kill the consul and the other guy. Cassius, who is the other Darkin, so the one who has the same powers as Mia, also dies as well, which means that all of her answers have just been taken away from her. It literally says, and with one final sigh, silent as he'd been in life, the Black Prince left it, taking Mia's answers with him. So she's now going to go on this long-ass, windy path to try and get some very basic answers about her powers. We learned that Trick's body was never recovered. So again, that furthers my theory that he's potentially still alive. And then the final chapter talks about a character called Cleo. We don't know who this character really is, but this is kind of setting the scene for the next book. Cleo, from what I understand, was also a Darkin, and she married somebody who I think was like really horrible towards her, like domestically abused her. But I think she kills him so that she can like subsume something from him or something. I don't know. I'm assuming we're going to learn more about that in book 2. I don't know if I'm going to read book 2, but yeah, I mean, it was an interesting way to end the book, actually, about another character that we've had absolutely zero insight into throughout this entire book. Very interesting, creative decision, in my opinion. So that's the book. I don't think this book is that great. I think it's very cringe. I think it's disgusting, to be honest. I think it's very male-gazy. That's not a word or a phrase that I use often. If you look at any of my videos, I don't think I've ever really talked about the male gaze, because I don't know, maybe it's just because the books that I read don't tend to have it, and if there are books that I do read that do have it, maybe I'm more forgiving of it because I think time and place is important. I think context is important. But this book was written in, let's have a look. This book was published in 2016. 2016. So that's not long ago, right? And I think this is where I tend to be a little bit less forgiving, right? Is if this was a book that was written in like the 1920s or the 1940s or the 1950s, you know, the world was a very different place back then. This was written in 2016. This was less than 10 years ago. And I don't think there's any excuse for this. I don't understand how this actually got approved by a publisher. Like, I really do not get it. I really don't get it. Like, I genuinely think there are just some downright disgusting things that are not only just alluded to, but outrightly said in this book. I cannot still get over the fact that she is 16 years old, described as looking younger than she is, and yet she is constantly put in a position where she is sexualized by other characters, and they're all male characters generally, and it just feels, oh, just even thinking about it now, like it just makes me feel really gross, to be honest. It makes me feel really gross. So I'm going to stop there. I did not like this book. I really did not. And my camera is telling me that I need more light. I think it's because the sun is setting. So we'll put that on to maybe help a little bit. But I think I'm going to finish this video here. Like, overall, not for me. I highly doubt I'm going to read the second book unless I get a number of requests for me to read it and do another video like this. But I'm glad I read it, because I've heard many things about this book, and now I've formed my own opinions about this book. But I genuinely think this is the dumbest book that I've ever read. Like, I think it's so dumb. I don't think it adds anything interesting to the conversation about writing or fantasy or dark fantasy. I think it is the most pointless book that I have ever read. Maybe aside from Fourth Wing, but that's not saying much, if you know what I mean. Like, it's just so bad. It's so bad. And I'm so glad I didn't actually read this before Empire of the Vampire, because if I had, I never would have read Empire of the Vampire. And while I did have issues with how women were portrayed in that book, and I talk about that in my review, it was less weird because the female characters, from what I remember, were adults. Like, they were actual adults. This is just weird. It's weird. And look, we all have our preferences, we all have our limits, we all have our own opinions about this sort of things. But to me, like, this doesn't also read like an adult fantasy series to me. But the fact that she's 16 and then you couple in all that weird stuff and then it's positioned as an adult fantasy book, like, it literally reminds me of like the Euphoria situation. Like, would have been so much better, so much less weird if she had been 18 or 21. And she would have been like a proper adult. I think, you know, you're 16, like, yeah, in the eyes of the law, there's certain things that you can do. But like, from 15 years old, 365 days old to 16, like, you don't automatically just mentally become an adult. Like, do you know what I mean? I think I'm getting increasingly frustrated as I talk about it. And I think I'm going to stop here for that exact reason. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did like it, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you have any strong opinions about this book, either way, if you liked it, if you absolutely hated it like I did, please do comment down below and I would love to take the conversation down there. Thanks for watching, folks. This is probably going to be my last rant review of 2024. I think there will be a rant review coming in February 2025 when I read the next Fourth Wing book. Book 3 is coming out at the end of January, so that should be interesting, and that will probably be my next rant review. So, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in my next one. Take care. Bye.